Right now, at this very moment, something is happening in the boating industry that defies everything you thought you knew about value, supply, and demand. Warehouses across America are packed wall to wall with brand new outboard engines. Not just a few hundred, not just a few thousand. We're talking about numbers so massive, they sound impossible. And here's the thing that'll make your jaw drop. These aren't broken engines. They're not damaged goods. These are pristine, barely used, state-of-the-art outboards that just 2 years ago people were fighting over, paying premiums for, waiting months to get their hands on. And today, they're being liquidated for pennies on the dollar, gone in 48 hours, vanishing into shipping containers and heading to places you'd never expect. But that's just the surface. What I'm about to reveal to you goes so much deeper than a simple market correction. This is about a hidden mechanism that's been operating behind the scenes, a series of decisions made in boardrooms and factories that set off a chain reaction nobody saw coming. And the consequences? They're affecting millions of people right now. Boat owners who thought they made the investment of a lifetime, dealers who mortgaged everything they own, banks that are scrambling to contain a financial crisis that's spreading faster than anyone wants to admit. And at the center of it all is a number, 2.7 million. That's how many new outboard engines are flooding the market as we speak. And by the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand exactly how we got here, who's paying the price, and what this means for the future of an entire industry. Now, I need you to pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you, because the story you think you know about supply and demand, it's about to get turned completely upside down. There's a reason why manufacturers are desperate to move these engines. There's a reason why perfectly good outboards with less than 70 hours of use are being sold for a fraction of their original price. And there's a reason why the people who bought these engines during the boom years are now facing losses that could haunt them for years to come. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what's happening right now, we need to go back to where it all started, back to a time when outboard engines weren't just products, they were symbols. They represented freedom, escape, and hope during one of the most uncertain periods in modern history. And that's where this story really begins. In the summer of 2020, something extraordinary happened, something that hadn't been seen in the boating industry for decades. Families who had never even considered owning a boat suddenly found themselves standing outside dealerships, waiting for hours just to talk to a salesperson. This wasn't your typical seasonal uptick. This was a phenomenon, a cultural shift that caught everyone by surprise. Showrooms that usually had rows of engines on display were empty by midday. Waiting lists that should have been a few weeks long stretched to 6 months, sometimes longer. And the mood? It was electric. People were texting each other about rumored shipments. Buyers were putting down deposits on engines they hadn't even seen. Some were calling from 3 states away, desperate to find a specific model before it disappeared forever. Between 2020 and 2022, over 1 million Americans bought their first boat. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 million first-time buyers in just 2 years. These weren't seasoned anglers or wealthy retirees with money to burn. These were young couples, parents with school-aged kids, recent college graduates pooling their savings with friends. For many of them, this wasn't just about buying a boat. It was about reclaiming something that felt lost. After months of lockdowns and isolation, the water represented possibility. It was a ticket to a different life, a way to reconnect with family, a chance to experience freedom when everything else felt restricted. Social media exploded with photos of new boaters on open water, birthdays celebrated from the deck, graduations marked with sunset cruises. Some people were even setting up remote workstations on their boats, turning conference calls into waterside adventures. The sense of scarcity drove the frenzy even higher. Friends swapped tips in Facebook groups about which dealers might have inventory coming in. Online forums buzzed with speculation about when the next shipment of Yamaha 150s or Suzuki 90 horsepower engines would arrive. At auctions, bidding wars erupted over used engines that in normal times would have been passed over without a second glance. And here's where things get really interesting, because while all of this was happening, while demand was exploding and buyers were lining up, the manufacturers were watching. They were taking notes, they were running the numbers, and they were making decisions. Big decisions, decisions that would reshape the entire industry. But those decisions, they weren't based on caution. They weren't based on conservative projections or careful analysis of whether this surge in demand was sustainable. No, they were based on pure, unadulterated optimism, and that optimism was about to trigger something massive. Inside the boardrooms of Mercury Marine, Yamaha, and Suzuki, confidence wasn't just high, it was through the roof. Executive teams looked at the sales figures from 2021 and saw not just a spike, but a new era. A fundamental shift in consumer behavior that would sustain growth for years to come. Factory managers were reporting backlogs that stretched for months. Dealer networks were screaming for more inventory, and the leadership, they decided to go all in. Mercury approved a major expansion of their high-output V6 and V8 assembly lines. They greenlit investments in cutting-edge automation. They increased their workforce at their Fond du Lac facilities. They weren't just ramping up production, they were transforming their entire manufacturing infrastructure to meet what they believed would be endless demand. Yamaha followed suit, announcing plans to reinforce large outboard production with advanced robotics and extended shift rotations. Suzuki committed to increased output for its premium models, citing North American demand as justification for returning to pre-pandemic growth targets. Internal planning documents that later surfaced in trade press and analyst calls revealed the scale of their ambition. Production forecasts anticipated continued double-digit growth. Some executive slide decks projected that the pipeline backlog in North America and Europe would absorb every single engine the factories could produce. Between 2022 and 2025, Mercury alone launched over 20 new V6 and V8 models. 20. That's not incremental growth, that's an all-out assault on maximum production capacity. Hiring surged. Technical and assembly roles were filled as fast as HR departments could process application. Overtime became routine. Third shift schedules were introduced at key plants, pushing both equipment and personnel to their absolute limits. One operations manager was quoted saying, "The goal was simple, never let a dealer wait for product again." Suppliers got swept up in the wave too, signing multi-year contracts for aluminum castings and semiconductors to keep the flow of components uninterrupted. By mid-2023, the industry's production machine was running at full throttle, churning out engines at a rate not seen in decades. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Not everyone inside these companies agreed with the pace. A handful of market analysts raised concerns about the durability of the demand. They warned that the pandemic spike might be temporary, that once life returned to normal, consumer behavior would shift back. Their cautions were documented in meeting notes and internal emails, but those warnings, they were overshadowed, buried beneath the urgency to capture top-line revenue and the fear of losing market share to competitors. The decisions had been made. The production lines were running. The supply pipeline that had once been a symbol of scarcity was now primed to flood the market. And what happened next? It's a case study in what happens when optimism collides with reality. Let me introduce you to someone who lived through this firsthand. Sarah Kay. She's run a dealership on Lake of the Ozarks for 30 years. She's seen boom years and slow seasons. She's weathered economic downturns and adapted to changing consumer tastes. But nothing in her 3 decades of experience prepared her for what she's facing in 2025. Right now, Sarah keeps a spreadsheet open on her laptop. Every day she updates it. Every day she tallies the cost of every unsold outboard lined up in her back lot. The number staring back at her? Over $400,000 in inventory. Most of it financed. All of it gathering dust. The engines are new. Some are still sealed in their original crates. But with every passing month, their value drops. And Sarah knows it. The roots of her predicament trace back to contracts she signed in 2022. Floor plan agreements offered by manufacturers like Mercury and Yamaha. These deals were structured with powerful incentives, big rebates if she crossed certain order thresholds. For Sarah, hitting those numbers meant doubling her usual spring order, 24 engines instead of 12. The math seemed straightforward. Each extra unit pushed her closer to a higher rebate tier. 2% back after 10 units, 5% if she hit 30. The difference could mean tens of thousands of dollars in bonus checks. enough to cover payroll through the slow winter months, enough to invest in showroom upgrades. It looked like a win-win situation, but the fine print hid risks that only became clear as the market began to cool. The loans that financed her inventory, known as floor plan loans, came with interest rates pegged to national benchmarks. In 2021, those rates were manageable, barely 4% above prime. But by late 2023, they had climbed past 8%. For every engine that didn't sell within the first 6 months, the carrying costs doubled, then tripled. And here's the killer. The agreements required regular principal payments, known as curtailments, every 90 days. If Sarah failed to move enough units, her rebates vanished. But the debt, that remained, every penny of it. Sarah remembers the calls from her manufacturer sales rep, friendly, encouraging, urging her to lock in allocation and chase the bonus. Declining the offer would have meant losing access to the most popular models the following year. So she signed. Just like hundreds of other small dealers across the country, she signed because saying no meant falling behind. It meant watching her competitors get the inventory while she got left out in the cold. Now, with the market flooded and buyers scarce, those incentives that once promised security have become a trap. Sarah has cut her staff in half. She's mortgaged her home to keep the lights on. She spends nights awake, calculating how many more months she can make the payments before the bank calls in the loan. The showroom that once bustled with families and excited first-time buyers now feels more like a warehouse. Engines line the walls, each one a reminder of how quickly optimism can turn into crushing liability. And Sarah isn't alone. Across the country, dealers are facing the same nightmare. Small operators who bet big on the boom are now drowning in inventory they can't move. Some have already closed their doors. Others are desperately trying to liquidate at any price just to stay afloat. But here's what makes this even more devastating. The buyers. The people who actually purchased these engines during the peak of the frenzy. Their stories are just as painful, maybe even more so. Meet Miguel. In the summer of 2021, Miguel stood on a dock looking at a brand new 150 horsepower Suzuki outboard. It was gleaming, perfect, not a scratch on the cowling. He remembers the day he signed the loan papers, putting 10% down on a $12,800 engine. The salesman told him it was built to last a lifetime, and for a while, it felt like a promise worth believing. Miguel took his family out on the water every weekend that first summer. They logged just over 40 hours by the time school started. It was everything he'd hoped for. Quality time with his kids, peaceful mornings fishing, sunset cruises with his wife. After that first summer, life sped up again. Work got busy. The kids had activities. By the end of 2022, the engine's electronic log showed only 61 hours of use, barely broken in for an engine designed to run for thousands of hours. Miguel isn't alone. Across the country, service centers and auction listings tell the same story. Outboards from the boom years, many with fewer than 70 hours on the meter, are flooding the market. ECU downloads from dozens of dealer trade-ins confirm the pattern. These are engines that are essentially still new, yet suddenly nobody wants them. By March 2025, Miguel needed to sell. His loan balance stood at $7,200, but the best trade-in offer he could find, $4,300, not even close to what he owed. He tried listing it privately online, but his listing got lost in a sea of hundreds of similar engines, all advertised as like new, all under 100 hours. All desperately priced to move. Miguel called his lender hoping for options, maybe a loan modification, maybe some way to restructure. The bank's answer was blunt and brutal. The market is saturated. Negative equity is now common. There's nothing we can do. After weeks of trying, Miguel gave up and arranged a voluntary surrender. In June, his engine was repossessed. The bank told him he was one of thousands, especially those who bought during the pandemic rush. Now underwater on their loans, facing steep losses on what they thought was a solid investment. The numbers are stark. For every outboard sold during the boom, there are now dozens sitting in garages and marinas, barely used. their owners facing financial consequences they never saw coming. The resale value of these engines has collapsed, not because they failed mechanically, not because they're inferior products, but because there are simply too many of them hitting the market at the same time. The promise of reliability and lasting value has collided head-on with a market reality that nobody predicted. For people like Miguel, the excitement of new ownership has given way to frustration, regret, and real financial hardship. These are real families dealing with real losses, and the scale of it's massive. Now you might be wondering, where are all these engines going? If they're flooding the market and dealers can't sell them and owners are surrendering them, what actually happens to 2.7 million barely used outboards? The answer will surprise you. Right now, outboard engines that were destined for American lakes and marinas are being packed by the hundreds into shipping containers, and they're not staying in the United States. They're bound for ports in West Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. Exporters are moving fast, buying up bulk lots from bankrupt dealers and auction houses, then rerouting these engines overseas where emissions rules are looser and demand for affordable power remains strong. Trade analysts estimate that 44% of the surplus outboards from the 2025 liquidation wave are being exported. Many of them still have the protective film on the cowlings, still in near-perfect condition. In places like Lagos and Cartagena, these engines fetch a premium. They're outcompeting local supply and reshaping regional boating economies in ways that will have long-term impacts. But that's not the only destination for these engines. At the same time, marine recyclers and salvage yards across the United States and Europe have seen a sharp and sudden rise in volume. About 28% of the excess inventory is being scrapped. These are engines that fail to meet new regulatory standards or arrive damaged from repossession. They're stripped for parts, broken down for raw materials, shredded and processed. And here's where things get concerning. Environmental groups have raised alarms about the lack of oversight in this process. Waste oil, heavy metals, and old electronics often escape proper handling, especially as underfunded recyclers struggle to keep pace with the unprecedented volume. Manufacturers publish compliance reports and claim they're following regulations, but critics argue that loopholes and inconsistent tracking make it far too easy for hazardous materials to slip through the cracks. Not every engine leaves the country or gets dismantled, though. A significant portion, roughly 25% of the oversupply, filters into what's known as the grey market. These are engines sold through unregulated online marketplaces, off-the-books auctions, and informal dealer networks. Buyers are drawn in by steep discounts, prices that seem too good to be true, and often they are. Many of these transactions lack proper warranty support. Service documentation may be missing or invalid. Some engines are misrepresented as newer than they actually are. Others are sold with hidden mechanical issues that only reveal themselves later. Consumer advocates have warned that the rush to move inventory has created fertile ground for scams, disputes, and fraud. Desperate sellers meet bargain hunters, and the results can be catastrophic for the unprepared buyer. The financial fallout extends far beyond individual buyers and dealers, though. Floor plan lenders and marine finance companies are now facing a wave of defaults unlike anything they've seen in recent memory. By mid-2025, more than 11,000 outboard loans are seriously delinquent. The greatest risk is concentrated in regions that saw the biggest surge in pandemic-era purchases: the Sunbelt, the Great Lakes, coastal communities. Lender reports show charge-off rates have tripled since 2022. As repossessed engines continue to flood secondary markets and auction values collapse further, some banks have made the decision to tighten credit standards dramatically. Others have exited marine lending altogether, unwilling to take on further exposure to a market in freefall. The consequences ripple outward in ways most people never see. Warehouse workers lose jobs as facilities close. International shipping companies adjust their routes and contracts. Insurance companies reassess their risk models. Local economies that depend on boating tourism and marine services take hits. And larger questions emerge. Questions about accountability, about who bears the responsibility when a boom turns to bust on a global scale. about what happens to industries built on projections that turn out to be catastrophically wrong. These aren't abstract questions. They affect real people, real communities, real livelihoods. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the full picture. In 2021 alone, over 300,000 new powerboats were sold in the United States. More than 1 million first-time buyers entered the market between 2020 and 2022. Manufacturers and dealers responded to this unprecedented demand by expanding production and inventory based on projections of ongoing double-digit growth. They built new assembly lines. They hired thousands of workers. They signed multi-year supplier contracts. They committed billions of dollars to infrastructure that assumed demand would not just continue, but accelerate. But as consumer spending patterns shifted and life began returning to pre-pandemic norms, the market cooled, and it cooled fast. Warehouses filled with like new outboards. Marinas ran out of storage space. Engines with less than 70 hours of use started piling up. Today, documented industry reports confirm the numbers I've been walking you through. Nearly half of these engines are being exported. Over a quarter are being scrapped. Thousands of loans remain delinquent with no clear resolution in sight, yet critical data remains either proprietary or incomplete. Full engine hour logs across the industry, the long-term impact on small independent dealers, the true scale of financial losses across the supply chain. Much of this information is locked away, unavailable to the public, hidden behind corporate confidentiality agreements. What we're witnessing is a clear case study in how short-term optimism and misread market signals can reshape an entire industry. For manufacturers, it's a lesson in the dangers of overproduction based on temporary demand spikes. For dealers, it's a brutal reminder that incentive structures can become traps when market conditions reverse. For buyers, it's proof that even products marketed as lifetime investments can lose value overnight when supply vastly exceeds demand. And for the financial institutions involved, it's a wake-up call about the risks of aggressive lending in niche markets driven by cultural moments rather than sustainable economic fundamentals. The collapse of the outboard market in 2025 stands as one of the most dramatic industry reversals in recent memory. It happened fast. It caught almost everyone off guard, and the fallout is still unfolding. Dealers are still fighting to survive. Buyers are still dealing with underwater loans. Banks are still processing defaults, and millions of engines are still sitting in warehouses, on docks, in shipping containers, waiting for their next destination. Some will find new homes overseas. Some will be broken down for parts. Some will sit unsold for years, slowly depreciating until they're worth almost nothing. For boaters and businesses alike, the story of 2025 is a stark reminder that in a world driven by demand, value can vanish almost overnight. The engines themselves haven't changed. They're still well-built, reliable machines. But their worth in the marketplace has collapsed because the ecosystem around them shifted. Too much supply, not enough buyers, prices in free fall, confidence shattered, and millions of people left holding assets that are worth a fraction of what they paid. This isn't just a story about outboard engines. It's a story about human behavior, about how we respond to scarcity and abundance, about how optimism can blind us to warning signs, about how incentives can drive decisions that seem rational in the moment but prove disastrous in hindsight. The 2.7 million engines flooding the market right now represent more than just inventory. They represent dreams deferred, investments gone wrong, businesses shuttered, families facing financial stress, an industry forced to reckon with the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms far removed from the people who would ultimately pay the price. And the lessons here extend far beyond boating. We've seen similar patterns in housing markets, in tech bubbles, in cryptocurrency booms and busts, in any market where rapid growth fueled by temporary factors creates the illusion of permanent change. The outboard industry just happens to be the latest example, and it's playing out right now in real time, affecting hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. So, what does this mean for the future? Will the market eventually stabilize? Will manufacturers scale back production to match realistic demand? Will dealers who survived the collapse emerge stronger and more cautious? Will buyers regain confidence? These questions don't have clear answers yet. What we do know is that recovery will take time. Trust has been broken, financial damage has been done, and the industry will have to rebuild from a position of caution rather than the reckless optimism that characterized the boom years. The engines sitting in warehouses today are a monument to what happens when supply and demand fall catastrophically out of balance. They're a reminder that no boom lasts forever, and they're a warning to anyone in any industry who might be tempted to believe that temporary surges represent permanent shift. The story of 2.7 million like new outboards being dumped for pennies on the dollar isn't over. It's still being written. New chapters unfold every day as more dealers close, more loans default, more engines get exported or scrapped. But the fundamental narrative is clear. This is what happens when an industry misreads the moment, when decision makers prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability, when warnings are ignored in favor of aggressive growth targets. The consequences are measured not just in dollars and cents, but in livelihoods disrupted, dreams abandoned, and an entire ecosystem thrown into chaos. And for the millions of people caught in the middle of this collapse, the lesson is painfully simple. In markets driven by hype and fear, value is fragile, and when it breaks fast.